Black Brawn, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
All right, welcome to Card Table. The time has come. Volume 5. So we've got this one. I've got 4 editions of this one. I just can't stop buying these editions. The content is the same in every one, but like I say, I'm a sucker for variant covers when it comes to Wild Cards novels. Not so much with comics, but with Wild Cards novels, I have to get every variant. Brian Bolland. They're just so well drawn. That's The Sleeper. As any Wild Cards fans know, The Sleeper wakes up every time, not just with a different superpower, but also a totally different body, so he looks different. So this is The Sleeper early in Volume 5, where he's got the sort of segmented insectile eyes, which Brian Bolland draws wonderfully, and then his power involves your basic electricity manipulation power, And then he goes to sleep at one point and wakes up looking more like that, with the shades and the shock white hair. Kind of looks like Doc from Back to the Future 2 there. Of course, if you've read the book, you know that the tiger is actually a little carving by the character Lazy Dragon, which we can talk more about in a second. And then we've also got, I don't have the Tor edition, but this is the original softcover edition by Bantam Books. Vagabond and her cats on the one side, and then there's Croyd again. And the second edition from Bantam, with the illustration by Tim Truman. Kind of a weird choice, kind of an interesting choice. That's the turtle in one of his shells up top, and it says, make love not war, and a peace sign painted on there. This is really from a flashback in the book, because the book is set in the 80s, but at some point during the hippie movement of the 60s, the turtle flew around in a shell that looked like that, and hippies painted various slogans and stuff on it. So it's a flashback to the 60s that happens in this book, and I think the character in front is possibly meant to be Mick Jagger. There's a sort of kind of running gag. I don't know if it happens enough to really call it a running gag. It's established in the first book that in this world, Mick Jagger is a wild card, and his wild card mutation is that he's a werewolf. So I think that's actually maybe meant to be Mick Jagger on the cover. Right? I don't know. Tell me in the comments if I'm way off. For a long time, I thought it was actually meant to be Buddy Holly, who transforms into a wild card at one point in this book. He's still alive in the 80s in the wild card universe, is infected with the wild card, and even though the way his transformation takes place during a concert, it's not really described with him like becoming. Does that look like a werewolf? I guess kind of. He sort of just looks like a Muppet or something to me. So I don't know. I sort of thought, well, if you just told the artist that there's a rock star on stage who transforms and mutates while he's singing, that maybe, I suppose the artist might just be like, oh, okay, I'll just turn him into some hairy thing. But yeah, so for a long time I thought, is that meant to be the Buddy Holly sequence? But I think the turtle having the hippie slogans is a giveaway that this is all set in the 60s. What can I say? As a youth, I didn't think things through when I would stare at these covers. So there you go, Wild Cards 5. So Wild Cards 5, it kind of introduces a new hybrid format into the Wild Card series. I've kind of, having gone through 1 through 4, have talked about the really the ones that lean more into the anthology element, where even though they all take place in a shared world, the stories are fairly self-contained, even though there might be threads that continue from one story to the next, or maybe a unifying theme. You get to the end of the book and it feels more like you've read a series of stories rather than a novel with a full arc that travels through that takes you through from the start of the book to the end. I think that's true of number 4, or I'm sorry, of book 1, where it's the running theme is essentially just wild cards through the decades, starting in the 40s and going up through the present, which the present meant 1987 at that time, or 86. And then Wild Cards 4, kind of the same thing, where the theme is similarly broad, only instead of going broadly over a range of time, it's broadly geographical, where we've had 3 books of the wild cards virus centered pretty much, certainly centered in America, but even more refined than that is, generally speaking, New York City. Though not always. There's definitely some stories, particularly in the first book, like the one that establishes Mick Jagger as a werewolf is set in Berkeley, California. Having done that for 3 books, being very America-centric, here's a look at how the Wild Cards universe has affected different countries. And so that's a more broad theme. And with the whole idea being a world tour. So the book just ends when the tour ends. It doesn't. There's no real climax it's being aimed toward. It's just sort of it's a 5-month tour of 40 countries. So when we get to the end of month 5 and we get to that 40th country, the book is done. With no particular climax. So it's that again. That's another example where it's really a Wild Cards anthology, just series of stories. Whereas Volume 2 is also still an anthology, but leans more towards the novelistic side, where there really is an underlying, villain or villainous presence, or multiple villainous presences. There is sort of a threat that's a threat to the world that's kind of unifying the whole book. That being basically the invasion of the swarm, the aliens that are referred to as the swarm. So the first stories kind of work to establish that threat, even though they still are self-contained to a large degree, but it's still, those early stories are about the coming of the swarm when they first arrive on Earth, and then the last story in the book is a depiction of the swarm being driven away permanently, or at least in the very, very long term. So that gives the book more of a sense of being a novel, albeit a novel comprised of individual short stories written by different authors. And then, of course, Volume 3, where they sort of invented a new form of novel in a way. Still a similar proposition in the sense that each author is writing about their own particular character. And author A writes about character B, and then author X writes about character Y, and so on throughout the anthology. That's still true of a book like number 3, but it's just one novel with 7 lead characters, and all 7 of those characters show up right in chapter 1, or and then move all the way through the book in parallel, essentially, albeit often crossing, not exactly parallel because they do intersect, and then all reaching their sort of collective, the book coming to a climax collectively for all 7 characters by the end, albeit still with each author writing their own characters. So it's 7 characters by 7 authors, which sounds like the name of a Pirandello piece or something. 7 characters by 7 authors, or something like what's the 7 Brides for 7 Brothers? There's something in there. It's a catchy phrase. So all 3 of those books kind of take a different tack. Those first 3, Volume 4 is kind of a reprise of the format of Volume 1, just going geographical instead of chronological. And then Book 5, as you might expect, kind of reprises the nature of Volume 2 a little bit, in the sense of still an anthology, but with there being sort of an overarching theme that ties them together so that it is more novelistic, like Volume 2. In Volume 2, it was the alien invasion, the swarm, alongside the Egyptian Freemasons and that element. But in this one, it's the gang war, which they kind of plant the seeds for in Volume 3, the gang war between the Mafia and the Shadow Fists. So kind of a similar deal. The gang war really kind of starts in the very first story here, and then essentially ends at the end of the book. So there is that sense of cohesion. What makes this a little different from Volume 2, and George R. R. Martin talks about it in the afterword to the iBooks edition of Volume 5, which I do not have. I got to put these down. I'm doing this whole thing with 5 books in my lap here. So Volume 5. Oh, sorry. That's another female admirer wanting to buy me dinner so that I can tell her all about wild cards. Sorry about that. It's going to keep happening. I don't know what to tell you. The difference with Volume 5, as kind of detailed in that afterword by Mr. Martin, is that they, I guess they realized as they were putting it together that it was a little tricky to create that novelistic arc if you were sort of doing a story about character A and then kind of leaving them behind in order to do a story about character B and then jumping to character C. Um, you really want character A to still be around, so they took this took this tactic of splitting a lot of the stories into multiple parts. So and they did a little bit of that in the earlier ones. Like if you look at Volume 2, the Modular Man story by Walter John Williams is broken into 4 parts, I believe, like a prologue and then Act 1 and then Act 2 and then a little epilogue. Um, and then in Volume 4, the Puppet Man story by Stephen Lee, the Tint of Hatred, has got it's I think it's called like prologue and then Tint of Hatred Part 1, Tint of Hatred Part 2, Part 3, and Part 4. Although in practice, it's almost more like a bunch of little small epilogues, like little 2 or 3 page vignettes, until you get to Tint of Hatred Part 4, which is really a full length story. So maybe in a couple of the earlier volumes, there would be maybe one story that would be broken up. And then, of course, you have like the interstitial, whose whole purpose is to be broken up into multiple parts and sort of provide a sort of mortar. But it's not really until Volume 5 where a bunch of the stories are split into multiple parts. So the Turtle story by Martin, the Sleeper story by Zelazny, the Tachyon story by Melinda Snodgrass, the story about Vagabond and Rosemary Gambione, who I mentioned before is sort of the Michael Corleone of the Wild Cards universe. All of those are broken up into, I think the Rosemary one is broken up into 3 or 4 parts. And then some of them are up to like 6, 7, 8 parts, I think. So it's almost half of the stories in here are split like that, are turned into serials, I guess you could say, within the book. I believe in the afterword by Martin, he doesn't seem too pleased with how it turned out. He says it was sort of dictated by necessity rather than by design. Interestingly, though, even though he kind of disparages that idea, it is used perhaps more deliberately in later books. But I mean, Volume 9 does a similar thing. Volume 19, some of the tour books like 19 and 22, those really lean into that idea of just splitting all the stories, and that becomes more the norm. Which really, of course, makes the book much more novelistic and less of an anthology feel, much more like the feel of a novel. And then in this book, in addition to the ones I just mentioned that are split into parts, and it's interesting too. I didn't think about this for a long time, but so you've got there's a yeoman story, of course, by John Joseph Miller. Edward Bryant does a Sewer Jack story. You've got Walter John Williams doing a Modular Man story. Pat Cadigan doing Water Lily. So almost all characters being reprised. And then Arthur Byron Cover does a very long story introducing 2 new characters to the wild card mythos. Quasi-Man and Leo Barnett. Leo Barnett is certainly a presence throughout the books, especially in the following book, number 6. He's a little bit of a red herring sort of character. I found, or not a major mover and shaker overall, but he's certainly significant. He's like a preacher whose stance on the wild card is very unappreciated by the wild card constituency. So he's a preacher and a politico. Runs for president in 1988. This book is set in 87. Actually, he announces his candidacy in this book, and so he's sort of the idea is that Greg Hartman also. Oh, and there's a Puppet Man story by Stephen Lee in this one too. That's not broken up. Um, and in that story, he also announces his intention to run for presidency. So they're gearing things up towards 1988, which is detailed in book 6. Details sort of the first phase of the big presidential battle, which takes place at the Democratic National Convention in July in Atlanta in 1988, just like in the real world. So, but Leo Barnett is, I see him as sort of a red herring character because the idea is that he's the guy who it seems like is going to be the worst possible president for if you're a wild card in this universe, because he's interested in there's talk of him that they all carry a disease, so wild card carriers should be quarantined or this or that. So seems like to the people watching at home within the wild cards universe, it seems like he's the villain. Meanwhile, of course, the irony is that Greg Hartman, the very pro wild cards candidate, is the guy with a secret agenda that's actually far more evil than anything Leo Barnett could cook up. So Barnett's a bit of a red herring in that regard, though we do get a little bit inside his head in this story here, his introductory story by Arthur Byron Cover. And then the other character, Quasi-Man, is he's a cool one. Really great concept. He's I believe his title is like caretaker at the Our Lady of Perpetual Misery, which is the Jokertown Catholic Church. He's a joker with a hunchback who kind of hangs out amongst the rafters of the church. So obviously the Quasi-Man is one of those great dual functioning names in the wildcard universe, because obviously there's the Quasimodo connotation with the hunchback and the church association. But then the other sort of connotation of quasi is also in play, where Quasi-Man he sort of phases in and out with reality. He's sort of literally not all there a lot of the times. Every so often, a part of his body will just sort of phase out of existence. And then the implication is that a lot of times when that happens, part of his mind is also phasing out of existence. And so part of his consciousness is actually in some other reality and perceiving other worlds. I think there's an implication in one book that that Quasi-Man might actually, if it weren't for this affliction, he would actually be possibly like genius level intellect. But because he's trying to perceive and apprehend different realities all at once, with one part of his consciousness in another world and one part here in the real world, or the physical world, that he can't really handle it, and so to casual observers, he actually seems as if he might be mentally disabled, when in fact it's quite possibly that he's actually like genius level IQ, but you just can't tell because of the nature of the quasi nature of his mind. So great concept, brilliant idea. I think a lot of the authors agreed. Arthur Byron Cover he never contributes another story after this one. He's one of the one-timers. At some point I'll do a video kind of looking at the actual list of whatever it is, 40 writers now who have written for Wildcards. There's a few that they just kind of came in once, did their thing, and then were never heard from again. Howard Waldrop is one of those, and Arthur Byron Cover is another. But his characters have kind of lived on, and I think a lot of other authors have seen the potential and the fun of the Quasi-Man concept, and Quasi-Man ends up being a pretty important character, for example, in what's called the Card Sharks Triad, a little bit down the line. And he's still around in the book set in the present day to post tour relaunch. So great character, great concept. But anyway, one thing I noticed thinking about this book is that all those books, or all those stories in here, or just about all of them, I think, that aren't broken up. So, for example, the Yeoman story, the Puppet Man story, the Quasi-Man one, the Sewer Jack one, they actually are broken up into sections, like John Joseph Miller does Roman numerals and I think Arthur Byron Cover does that too. So part I, part II. Stephen Lee breaks up his story by days of the week. So the first chapter of his little, and these stories are pretty long in some cases, almost like novella length. They feel that way. Um, so they're the Puppet Man one is the first section is Saturday or whatever. The next section is Sunday. Maybe the Sewer Jack one does that too. Unfortunately, the Bantam edition, it's just always annoyed me about the Bantam edition. All it says on the, how that you get these little clues as to where you are in the book with these little things at the top. A lot of the other books will actually, it'll say like wild cards or whatever on one side, but it'll say, or Down and Dirty, which is the title of book 5, if I didn't mention that. But then the other, so like the left hand will say Down and Dirty, but the right hand will actually tell you what story you're in. Pretty helpful and pretty absent from book 5, where it just says Down and Dirty at the top of every page, and it's really long. It's 520 pages. So yeah, like, okay, where's that Sewer Jack story? God knows. But I guess the Water Lily story by Pat Cadigan is not broken up. But what I wondered is, did they break them up by Roman numerals because George R. R. Martin told them, hey, we might have to break up your story into sections, so do that for me, so that if I need to, I can split up, Roman numeral 1 section from the Roman numeral 2 section. Because actually, when I was reading these, I did a recent reread of this where I was trying to be very careful about noting the sort of time scale of each story, and realizing that some of the stories that, even though they aren't broken up, if you actually wanted to put it strictly chronological, you would have to break them up. So like the Sewer Jack story and the Puppet Man story are each unbroken. They each are in a different part of the book. But if you looked at them strictly chronologically, they actually really belong more like this, because they do actually overlap, taking place sort of on the same date. Certain parts of one story take place on the same date as parts of the other story. Is that interesting to anyone but me? I don't know. There are other parts of the book where they're kind of sequenced a little unchronologically. Ultimately, it's very clear when you read it that Martin and possibly Snodgrass as well, as they're sequencing this stuff, they're just doing it kind of for maximum comprehensibility, more so than, so, which is in many cases it's easier to handle all these different narratives if some of them are just kind of bunched all together, rather than splitting up every single story in the book and having them all hopscotch over each other. It might get a little confusing. And I don't know if I've been clear on that in talking about the books so far, because I sort of enjoy unraveling them and looking at how complex it all is. And maybe I'm burying the lead, which is that in terms of how they're actually presented, they're very readable, very comprehensible. There's always a lot going on, but it's always very easy to follow, thanks to, I think, Martin's editorial efforts, Martin and Snodgrass as editors. So certainly don't want to lose sight of that, since I am trying to promote these books and talk about how good they are. I certainly don't want any of my convoluted meanderings to make it sound like the books are actually less accessible than they are. They are very accessible and always incredibly entertaining, including this one, which even Martin in the afterword is a little bit sour on, which I appreciate his candor. I mean, it's his book, and he obviously wants people to read it, but in his afterword, he does kind of talk about how, I wish we'd maybe done this differently or that differently. What he has mentioned in this book about this book in that afterword is that it was the publisher who told them, well, a gang war is not really enough to sustain an entire novel. There has to be other things going on. And Martin sort of said, well, there are, because it's not just a gang war between two rival gangs. These gangs are hiring, aces with superpowers, and there's all these, relationships and secrets and betrayals. That seems like plenty. Plus, this is part of the second triad, which, as I mentioned before, becomes a quartet that starts in volume 4, continues into this one, and then goes into 6 and 7 too. And in volume 4, they sort of reintroduce Puppet Man and make him a really the preeminent threat the main villain, the big bad of this triad, whereas the astronomer was sort of the big bad of the first triad. And then there's kind of a secondary threat, which is the Team Elise, Time Alice, as John and I like to call him. Team Elise, who sort of is a puppet master himself, and who was the preeminent villain in the country of Haiti until the world tour gave him the opportunity to come to America. So now he's in America. And those are threads that are meant to be resolved in the next couple books, but they have to be kept kind of ticking along. So not only is there the gang war, but they have to, keep the Puppet Man thread going and the Team Elise thread going. And apparently the publisher said, that's still not enough. Give us more, which led to the idea of making Croyd Crenson a carrier for a contagious version of the wild card, where it's established that if you have the wild card virus, you could pass it on genetically to your offspring, but you can't, breathe on somebody and give it to the person sitting next to you. Until Croyd wakes up with this contagious mutation of the wild card, which creates, this huge kind of panic and, people being told to stay at home and quarantine, and a lot of people wearing paper masks, all pretty ridiculous stuff. I mean, it's hard to imagine that ever really happening, but sci-fi, what are you going to do? So that's why the book it's pretty thick, and that's why there are so many different stories, some of them having to be cut into smaller sections so that they can wind through each other, which, if this was like a self-contained novel, I can see why you would not like the sort of the chaos of this one, where it starts out being about a gang war, and then kind of almost not until halfway through does the whole Croyd Crenson contagious virus thing really start to come into play. I feel like you're almost halfway through the book before you meet Typhoid Croyd, as they end up calling him. So yeah, certainly if it was a self-contained book, you wouldn't expect that. I picked up this book about a superhuman gang war. Halfway through it, instead, it's about a viral pandemic. Again, the idea of a pandemic just interrupting what was already going on. So ridiculous. So yeah, if it was one book, that lack of formal, that lack of adherence to the Aristotelian unities might be more bothersome. But for me, I think since it's just one book in this ongoing saga that's already kind of soap operatic and has lots of different threads kind of winding in and out, I'm less bothered by the what some might argue is inelegant form. Though I will say it's good knowing that the virus thing is a thing, that the typhoid Croyd is going to be a thing. The first time I read this book, I had no idea. I mean, and I don't know that they even say. I guess this stuff is always just kind of, I don't even know what you call it, just kind of boilerplate, kind of just concession to someone in marketing. I feel like the description on the back of almost every sci-fi book I've ever read has been kind of a weak sell. So I don't know, I feel like Wildcard, these old Bantam paperbacks, when you read these little descriptions, I just find them so unsatisfactory. But there's nothing about the virus in this, or nothing about the Typhoid Croyd plotline. It's all about the gang war, I think. Yeah, the first time reading this as however old I was, 12 years old or something ridiculous, 13 years old. So hard for me to wrap my brain around the fact like that what I thought was going to be a book about a gang war became about Typhoid Croyd halfway through. Kind of messed with my head. So I do think it's a better book going in. I think I mentioned before that these books are better on reread. They always kind of improve on reread because you kind of know where they're going. Certainly true of this one, where if you know that there's going to be this Typhoid Croyd plot element, you can kind of see the seeds being planted early on. Plus, anyone who's used to reading comic books in like collected form, where you go and read like a Marvel Masterworks, and it's just like 10 issues of a certain comic, and particularly if it's something like Uncanny X-Men, where there's so many soap operatic elements, you're probably, if you've read a lot of those kind of trade paperbacks, you're so used to the fact that not every plot line is going to be introduced in chapter 1, some plot lines might actually be introduced in the fourth comic in that collection of 10 rather than the first, or that some plot lines might get resolved in the sixth issue of those 10 issues, that it's not going to be this perfectly elegant Aristotelian, Chekhovian, every gun introduced in the first act will be fired in the final act. That said, a lot of the Wildcards volumes do have a lot of impressive formal elegance, so I guess for some people maybe this volume does frustrate in that way. But I can't say it's ever bothered me too much. Generally speaking, I have a pretty high opinion of this one. I think it's a lot of fun. I think a lot of the individual stories are very good. All right, so I've already been talking for about a half an hour here about the book, and I haven't even gotten to one story. So I won't talk for too much longer in this video. We can talk more about book 5 over the course of a few episodes. But we can at least talk about the very first story, right? Which is titled, wait for it, Only the Dead Know Jokertown, written by John Joseph Miller, once again writing about Yeoman, continuing the saga that started in the very first book about Yeoman's vendetta against Kian. So the premise of Only the Dead Know Jokertown might be, as I think about it, it probably is my favorite Yeoman story, actually. Yeah, it's my favorite. I think it's just the most overall really enjoyable. So the premise of this one is that he decides to get facial reconstruction surgery so that he can join the Shadow Fists and try and kind of take them down from within. And so it starts with this very cool sequence where he manages to get himself insinuated. Daniel Brennan gets himself insinuated into the Shadow Fists as a sort of facially disguised version of himself, calling himself Cowboy. And right away gets involved in this operation alongside several other aces that are employed by the Shadow Fists. Fade Out, I think. It's a quartet of Shadow Fists, Whiskers, Deadhead, Lazy Dragon, and then Brennan, a.k.a. Cowboy, who are there to steal a corpse from the morgue in the Jokertown Clinic, because Deadhead's ace ability is that he can consume the brain of a corpse. And in so doing, he's able to absorb their memories, which is a great, wonderfully gruesome concept, especially in execution, where the character literally. I remember I had this thought myself, and then I saw somebody else make the same comment on a message board. Like, how exactly does somebody discover a power like that? Like, how do you know that if you eat a brain, you'll absorb the person's memories? The implication is that the guy must have something really wrong with him, because he ate a brain not knowing that would happen. He just wanted to eat a brain for its own sake. And then when you meet the character, he's portrayed in such a way where you can immediately see that, yeah, he does seem like the kind of guy who might just eat a brain for its own sake. And then you got Lazy Dragon, who I certainly didn't realize when I first read this book. I remember as a 13-year-old, because he seems like just sort of a supporting character in the Yeoman story. So I assume, he's created by John Joseph Miller. But no, he's actually the creation of the writer William F. Wu, who eventually will write a story from Lazy Dragon's POV for Volume 8. But for right now, he's still a supporting character. So his ability is one of my favorites in Wildcards, where he's able to, his spirit can animate any statue that he carves himself, or builds himself, or sculpts himself. So he could create an origami bird, for example, and then let his consciousness flow into that bird, and then it would actually mutate, become an actual bird, life size, with Lazy Dragon's mind inside it, and then could fly around, spy. And although I don't know if we ever see him animate a bird, but we see him animate a mouse, for example. They start small, of course, so you think, because the mouse is actually normal size, and then later in the book, you get I'm trying to remember the first time, actually, but this is actually one example of a scene where he basically creates like a tiny tiger out of like a bar of soap, and then once he animates it, it becomes literally a full-sized tiger. Sort of over the course of Wildcards, you see him sort of animate bigger and bigger things. You see him, animate like a polar bear because he needs to sort of navigate through the snow at one point, and then at one point it turns out that he's not limited to real animals, where he can actually become like a Chinese dragon, like a gigantic fire-breathing mythological creature. So how cool is that? And then there's this. So here's another example of what I mean when I say these books. Every single one of these books gets better the more you reread it, because there's so many details. It's I don't want to say it's impossible to catch everything at first reading. Maybe there's some genius level reader who can really absorb every scrap of information, but I mean, these books are just so dense. So there's a bit about how Lazy Dragon wears pants that are extra baggy, and nothing is made of the fact that he wears extra baggy pants. I mean, it's just this thing that Yeoman happens to observe when he meets him. And it sounds like just a fashion choice. There's a reason he wears baggy pants. I mean, how could you possibly, when you're reading a book with all that other stuff going on, how could you possibly register on first reading that Lazy Dragon wears baggy pants? It's such a minor detail. Explained later. Explained in book 8. There's a reason for everything in Wildcards. Yeah, so then Brennan manages to ingratiate himself into the Shadow Fists. The mission to steal the corpse is successful. He also ends up. So he's sort of there at a point when the sort of rivalry between the Mafia and the Shadow Fists is heating up. So he's with some high-level Shadow Fists when they're attacked by a sort of Mafia contingent, and there's your sort of inciting incident for the full-out gang war that comprises so much of that of book 5. So, and then Brennan ends up going on like a solo mission to assassinate a mafioso, and there are other complications involving Wraith, aka Jennifer Malloy, with whom Brennan teamed. It's hard when you're speaking to not end a sentence with a preposition. Up with whom Brennan teamed in Volume 3 against the Shadow Fists. And there's right away there's a bit of romantic sexual tension between Brennan and Wraith in Volume 3, and that little thread is sort of progressed in Volume 5. A little bit of romance. You gotta, in your action movie, in your 80s action movie, you gotta have some romance. Only the Dead No Joker Town, the Yeoman story in Volume 5 is particularly just particularly packed, really action packed, really exciting, and really gives a great start to. I mean, it really is. It almost feels like what could have been used as the pitch to the publisher to show, like, look, a gang war between rival factions who both have superhumans working for them. Look at this first story. I mean, it's so what a cool premise. I mean, it's just so fun to read about. Yeah, so you really see Miller kind of delivering on the promise of the book's initial premise right away, where just this whole idea of the Mafia versus the Shadow Fists seems incredibly exciting, incredibly engaging. All these cool new wild cards introduced. Most particularly, well, there's also Fade Out, who's Fade Out was introduced already in Volume 3. But we see a little bit more of him in this one. Just one of those more like kind of fun, almost cannon fodder characters. Although he does actually play a significant role in some future books. But basically, just a super criminal who can turn invisible. Nice and straightforward. I mean, you'll never see him coming. What more do you need to know? Fade Out plays a significant role in this, but certainly the two standout Shadow Fists are Deadhead and Lazy Dragon. I feel like the very first time I read this book and read that first story and was introduced to Lazy Dragon and Deadhead, I just kind of found myself going, like, hot damn, I love this book already. This is going to be great. So yeah, really, really great, really explosive, both in the literal and figurative sense, a start to the book. So far, we're 1 for 1 on Down and Dirty. What are the next couple stories? Hey, the hardcover has the actual titles of each story. Unfortunately, this is like such a... I bought this copy off of eBay, I think, and it's like you can just hear the pages coming unglued when you open the book. Like, oh no, is it going to disintegrate if I actually try to like read this copy? I've never actually read the book with reading this copy. I've always kind of gone to one of the paperbacks. We did only did No Joker Town, and next we've got the Sleeper story. So next we've got some of those stories that are broken up into individual parts, so we can look at some of those. One other noteworthy thing about this book before I sign off is I kind of mentioned some of the bits about chronology and about things not being presented in rigorously chronological order, because obviously that's not always the best way to present a story. In order to maximize suspense, to maximize comprehensibility. I guess it's just something about my brain. I have a weird notion of, I always am fascinated to see if you were to read the stories chronologically, how they all lay out. But this one is so unchronological. There's actually a little author's note or editor's note at the start where they say, because the previous book started in December of '86 and ended in April of '87, and then this book starts in October of '86, which is before the start of Volume 4. So it's like they're going backwards in time. So there's like a little editor's note saying, just trying to be realistic, and just because a bunch of people flew away on this world tour doesn't mean things stopped happening in New York. So we're gonna start this book actually before the world tour even left, and then we'll show you what was going on in New York during those 5 months of the world tour while all those people were away, and then the latter part of the book is what we see when all those people return from the world tour. Tachyon being one of the most significant, of course. I have made like a little spreadsheet to show chronologically where in book 5 we are at any given point compared to where you are in book 4 on the world tour. I have read the books that way, where I actually pick up, read one story in book 5, move back, read a couple stories in book 4, go back to book 5. I've done that. I'm not going to apologize for it. I've done it. All right. Maybe I've even done it more than once. Don't judge. Like I say, I enjoy just kind of reading things, in chronological order, just to see how it. Sometimes you get kind of interesting, kind of surprising juxtapositions that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise, which can be fun. So, but anyway, just something to note about that book and about the sort of the way things are sequenced. That it actually almost that entire Yeoman story, I think, is set before the tour leaves. Certainly the opening scene is set before the world tour leaves. So you get a little interaction between Yeoman and Chrysalis, who I mentioned before is a favorite character of mine, like one of the first really cool female characters in Wildcards, in my opinion, created by John Joseph Miller. Gets the cover of Volume 4 in the Brian Bolland UK edition. But she's part of the world tour. So how the heck do you get her in the beginning of Volume 5? Well, you set the beginning of Volume 5 before the tour leaves so that Chrysalis can still be there. So now, having established that, I think now we know everything there is to know about the structure of Volume 5, the format, the sequencing, the chronology. So now, going forward, next time, we'll have a look at some of the individual stories. But like I say, it starts with a real bang. The John Joseph Miller Yeoman story at the start. One of the best stories in the volume, in my opinion, and also just one of the best Yeoman stories overall. So yeah, we can leave on a high, positive note for this episode. So thanks for watching Card Table. As always, if I fail to say, like I always say, if you're watching and saying, I can't believe he talked about the Yeoman story in Volume 5, and he didn't mention the coolest thing about it, what a jerk. Leave it in the comments. That's what the comments are for, to call me a jerk. Thanks to all you Wildcards fans who are watching, continuing to watch. Hope you'll keep watching. And next episode of Card Table, more of Volume 5, Down and Dirty.
Doesn't have any class. She says, "Hon, what is it?" "I'm trying to visit with my pal Melinda Snodgrass. Shoot the breeze with Walter John Williams. Hang out with Howard Waldrop. I've been smarting for George R.R. Martin. His characters have so much pop. I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. My heart's broken several places. Baby's just sitting there reading about aces."